And then the next two that I want to talk about, I want to focus on a little more in depth because I found in the literature that often, and in my own experiences, that often these come into play with suicidal ideation and thoughts. The next one, meaninglessness. Life doesn't come automatically with meaning. In other words, when we're born into this world, we're not given an automatic meaning of why we're here. We all find ourselves asking the big question, why are we here? Now, we may have been handed by our parents or whoever raised us some kind of meaning through a religion that we're exposed to, and that may or may not work for us. But at some point, we have to decide what our lives are about. We have to choose some purpose. We have to find some reason that we're waking up every morning. You can choose from the options offered, choose from the list of religions or whatever, or pick your own. But you have to find a purpose. You have to find meaning. And oftentimes when people are feeling suicidal, they feel like their life has no meaning. And the final existential concern that I want to talk about, my favorite one, not my favorite one to experience, but my favorite one to talk about, is isolation. Isolation, fear of isolation. There's 3 different types of isolation that I want to talk about. The first one, and I will stage this out theatrically, the first one is interpersonal isolation. In other words, we all have social relationships, people in our lives, and there's times in our lives when our social relationships may not be what we want them to be, may not be as fulfilling, and that's something that ebbs and flows in our lives, the degree of interpersonal isolation that we experience. The second is intrapersonal isolation, and that's the idea of feeling isolated from ourselves, from maybe parts of ourselves are cut off or lost or we're not in touch with. For example, there might be something that we used to love to do when we were 10 years old and we don't do it anymore, and we've lost that parts of ourselves. And in order to not feel intrapersonally isolated, we need to have all those parts of ourselves intact and connected. And finally, the final one, existential isolation. And what I mean by that is the reality that no man, no woman, no human being can ever fully share his or her consciousness with another human being. In other words, I can come close to you and I can talk to you, but I can never truly experience or know exactly what you're experiencing, and you can never know exactly what I'm experiencing. So ultimately, we're alone. We're born alone, we die alone, we're in our own bodies. Ultimately, we're alone. And that can be scary. That can be a very scary experience. But there's hope. There's hope. There's a caveat that I want to talk about. The fact that we all experience that we're all ultimately alone, well, we're not alone in that. Everybody else goes through that too. I'd like to share another musical reference for a moment. I'm going to turn back to the 80s. For those of you who are familiar with a band called The Police, and there's a song by The Police called Message in a Bottle, where the lead singer, well, I don't know who wrote it, but Sting, or Gordon Sumner, decides to put a message in a bottle asking if anyone else is out there. Does anyone else feel alone? And he throws the bottle out into the ocean, waiting for a reply. Does anyone else feel this? And then, one day, lo and behold, he wakes up and woke up this morning, don't believe what I saw. 100 million bottles washed up on the shore. Seems I'm never lonely being alone. 100 million castaways looking for a home. 100 million castaways looking for a home. That's all of us. Seems I'm never lonely being alone. Never lonely being alone. So if you know that you're not alone in your aloneness, that itself can be comforting. I teach a class called group counseling, and I've also done a lot of group counseling. And one of my favorite moments, and one of, I think, the students' favorite moments, is when we're sitting around in a circle and we realize that other people share our experiences. suddenly we realize, wait a minute, I'm not the only one who struggles with perfectionism, or wait a minute, I'm not the only one who worries what other people think, or wait a minute, I'm not the only one who's worried about the way my life is going, or I'm not the only one who feels lonely. So we realize that we all experience the same things. We're all in the same boat together. And that is a concept or a therapeutic factor known as, go Kyle, universality. Universality. The idea that we're all in this boat together, that we all experience the same things. And as I've read the literature on suicide, as I've talked to clients about their own suicidal feelings, as I've experienced my own despair in my life, there's always a common theme that I see, and that is this feeling of isolation. Nobody understands me. Nobody gets me. I'm all alone. To illustrate this further, what I'd like to do now is I want to turn to a transcript of a conversation that I had with a friend recently about her own experience trying to kill herself. And I'm going to do this like a little sort of play dialogue. I'm going to call this friend Agnes. And the way I'm going to do this is Agnes will be sitting over here, and I will sit over here, and I'll try my best to jump back and forth without too much distraction. So here is Agnes's story and my conversation with her. Looking back now, it was a cry for help, but I didn't know it at the time. I felt the weight of the world was on me. I had gone on for so long being so unhappy and feeling like no one understood what I was going through and no one could help. And at that point, I felt there was nothing anybody could do to make me feel better. And I was just tired. I got home and it was like everything came crashing down. The disappointment of being lost and unimportant and misunderstood. It came crashing down and I lost it. So, one moment here. Lost, unimportant, and misunderstood. I want you to listen carefully to the themes of perhaps meaninglessness as well as isolation. Listen to the themes of isolation. I totally spiraled. I started drinking, and a few hours later, I was in the kitchen looking at knives. I got the electric knife blade. Mom always told me to be careful, but it was really hard. I couldn't do it. That skin there is tougher than you think. So, you couldn't do it. No. I couldn't slit my wrists. I just couldn't do that. So, there was a bottle of, I think, Ambien, sleeping pills of my mom. So I took that, all of it, and, oh. Agnes went on to tell me about how she washed down the pills with a bottle of bourbon she'd been drinking. Her friend found her, shook her, and tried to wake her up, screaming, "What did you do? What the fuck did you do?" Agnes was rushed to the hospital where they pumped her stomach, and she spent the night in the psychiatric ward. Agnes, how did they help you afterwards? They didn't. They tried, but they couldn't. My psychologist and psychiatrist that I was going to, they kept focusing on the guy that I was dating, and I kept trying to tell them he was not the cause. He was the trigger, but he was the last straw. He's not the problem. I felt like this for years. I have been depressed for years, and it just never, they just wouldn't focus on it. Agnes, you said you've been depressed for years. Can you describe to me what it is that you call depression? It's the feeling of just heaviness. A lot of times you just cry because it hurts to smile. You're just so phenomenally overwhelmed and you just can't do anything anymore, and it's hopeless. I've been working on it, but I have to constantly remind myself that, number one, it's not hopeless and there's always a new day. And number two, sometimes the only thing that keeps me from spiraling down so bad again is thinking of all the people who would feel so bad if something did happen. Agnes, when you get depressed, do you feel fear too? Mm-hmm. What kind of fear? Describe the fear. Just kind of, it goes back to my fear of being alone, I guess. I start feeling like nobody understands me, and nobody can relate to what I'm going through, and I just feel very isolated, and I don't like that feeling. Isolated. Isolated. Nobody understands, and nobody will let me talk about it. Interestingly, a couple of days later, I got a phone call from Agnes in which she told me this. She said, Nancy, you're not going to believe this, but after our conversation, I took a drive out to my mom's house, realizing for the first time that I was not going out there to run away from an empty house, but instead to be with people I love. And on the way, as I was driving, the same drive that I've driven 10,000 times before, I was seeing things that were so beautiful that I'd never even noticed before. And I realized that I had this peace over me. And it was so calming and almost euphoric. It was a feeling of satisfaction and euphoria that I had not felt for a long time. So what happened? I didn't do anything. All I did was listen. Just listen. All I did was listen and get it. All I did was understand her pain. So what I want to illustrate there is what happened is a couple of things. One, Agnes, as she told me her story, experienced a couple of things. One is this idea of universality. As she talked and I listened and I understood her experience and her pain, she realized that she wasn't alone, that she wasn't crazy, that I got it. I understood her experience. She wasn't alone in this. Another thing happened too, and that is what we call the therapeutic factor of, it's up there, catharsis. Catharsis, that as we are allowed to talk about our pain and let it out, it kind of frees us up. Do you ever have a really good cry where you just let it all out and you feel the sense of relief afterwards? That's the therapeutic factor known as catharsis. And we've all experienced it. And yet so many times we don't allow people to do this, to talk about their pain because we're so afraid of hearing it. Instead, we do a couple of things. One thing is, when it comes to our own suicidal thoughts, there's a tendency, or even just our pain in general, there's a tendency to try to push the thoughts away. I've heard a lot of people say that they fear that if they actually entertain their thoughts, that will lead them to go through with it. When actually, it's just the opposite. And also, if you push your thoughts away, they don't go away. They just go somewhere else. When we keep disturbing thoughts and feelings inside of us, they grow and they get bigger. And in the case of someone who represses their thoughts, it may lead to an ulcer or other physical ailments. Or, in some cases, it may lead to more outwardly forms of self-destruction, such as where are those kitchen knives, where are those pills. But when we try to push our thoughts away, they don't go away. They just grow and move into another form. But at some point, we have to get rid of them. There's another myth when it comes to listening to other people's suicidal thoughts. Something that I've heard a lot of people talk about is that this fear that if we let people talk about their suicidal thoughts and we help them to name it, that somehow we plant the idea inside them and that will make them more likely to do it, when actually that's not true at all. First of all, we can't plant the thoughts inside them. They're already there. But the idea that it would make them more likely to do it is completely unfounded. It's actually exactly the opposite. It's a total 180. When we let people talk about their feelings and their pain, they lose their power. They lose their power. So the way through pain is not around it or running away from it, but through it. We have to allow people to go through their pain and to help them through it.